NBA Youngboy's father just turned 53 years old, and the way he continues to live behind bars is sad. Isolated, separated from his family, watching his grandchildren grow up through a prison visitation room, while his son became one of the biggest names in hip-hop. He has a sentence that stretches so far into the future, it is almost hard to believe. And every appeal he has filed has come back denied. Stay with us until the end, because what happened to this man and what it did to this family is something you need to hear in full. But real quick, if you're serious about winning in the rap game, I put everything I know into one ebook. I'm talking how to actually grow an audience from zero, how to get labels reaching out to you with deals, and even how to get paid in this industry without ever touching a mic. And nah, it's not too late. People love to say the wave passed. It didn't. New artists and new hustlers are blowing up every single day, and the ones eating are the ones who started now instead of waiting. It's only $39. That's a few cups of coffee for a blueprint that can change how you move in this game forever. Links in the description bio, go grab it, then let's get back to the video. Yo, what's good, fam? Today we are breaking down the full story of NBA Youngboy's father, Jeffrey Staten. We are going to get into how he ended up behind bars, the brutal details of the crime that put him there, how his own family played a role in sealing his fate in court, what life looks like for him now at 53 with decades still left on his sentence, and what all of this has meant for Youngboy growing up without his father present. This one is heavy, so let's get into it. The man at the center of this story is Jeffrey Staten, also known in some records as Jeffrey Staten. He is the biological father of Kentrell Deshaun Gaulden, the rapper the world knows as NBA Youngboy. Despite that connection to one of the most recognized names in modern hip-hop, Jeffrey Staten's own life has unfolded in a direction that could not be more different from his son's. While Youngboy built a career defined by chart records, massive fan loyalty, and an almost unstoppable musical output, his father has spent those same years inside a prison cell in Louisiana, separated from much of his family by steel doors, court orders, and a sentence that feels impossible to fully absorb when you hear the numbers. The contrast between these two lives, both of which grew from the same family tree in Baton Rouge, is the kind of thing that stops you cold when you actually sit with it. To understand how Jeffrey Staten ended up in this situation, you have to go back to December 1st, 2009. That was the morning everything changed. According to court records and contemporaneous news reports, Jeffrey Staten was involved in an armed robbery at a Baton Rouge convenience store called Albie's Market, located on North Sherwood Forest Boulevard. What happened inside that store on that Tuesday morning was not a smash-and-grab situation or a petty theft going sideways. It was a violent, premeditated robbery that left one of the store's employees seriously injured, and it set off a chain of legal events that would ultimately land Jeffrey Staten in prison with a sentence measured not in months or even in years, but in decades. Before we get into the specifics of that morning, it is worth taking a moment to understand the world Jeffrey Staten was living in before everything collapsed. Baton Rouge in 2009 was a city where the pressures of poverty, limited opportunity, and street-level survival had been grinding people down for generations. It was the same city that produced NBA Youngboy just years later. The same streets, the same neighborhoods, the same cycles that trapped families across multiple generations. Jeffrey Staten was a man in his early 30s at the time of the robbery, with a young son at home, in a life that from the outside offered no indication it was about to be permanently altered by a single decision made on a Tuesday morning in December. But that is exactly what happened. And the impact was felt not just by Jeffrey Staten himself, but by every member of his family, including a son who was still young enough to be playing outside and figuring out what the world was made of. The details that emerged from the case were disturbing. According to court documents, Jeffrey Staten entered the store during the robbery and pointed a gun directly at a store employee named Sam Tran. When Tran failed to comply with his commands, Staten pistol whipped him across the head, leaving him dizzy and bleeding. After learning that the store safe operated on a time lock system and could not be opened, Staten shot Tran in the right leg. Another store employee was also held at gunpoint during the incident. The two victims were zip-tied, and a plastic bag was placed over one of their heads. The robbery was not impulsive. It was calculated, coordinated, and brutal in its execution. And those facts would follow Jeffrey Staten all the way through his trial and every appeal that came after it. When police began investigating the robbery, both Jeffrey Staten and his brother Dallas Staten were identified as suspects. Dallas turned himself in to law enforcement on December 4th, just days after the robbery. Jeffrey turned himself in shortly after. But what happened next in the legal proceedings added a layer to this story that many people find just as difficult to process as the sentence itself. Dallas Staten, Jeffrey's own brother, would become a central figure in the prosecution's case. The two brothers had been involved in the same robbery, walked through the same door together that December morning. And yet, the path their legal cases took would end up going in very different directions, with Dallas's cooperation with law enforcement becoming a significant piece of the framework that built the state's case against Jeffrey. That is the part of this story that hits differently when you really think about it. Blood does not always hold the way people expect it to when the legal system gets involved, and when the possibility of a long sentence starts becoming real. Dallas Staten had his own serious exposure in this case. He was charged with armed robbery and attempted first-degree murder alongside his brother. Facing those kinds of charges can fundamentally change a person's calculation about loyalty versus self-preservation. When Dallas's cooperation entered the picture, it added something to the prosecution's case that was hard for any defense to fully neutralize. A brother who was there, who knew what happened from the inside, providing information to the state. For Jeffrey Staten, that moment had to have carried its own emotional weight entirely separate from whatever legal consequences follow. There is something uniquely devastating about having someone you grew up with, someone who shares your last name and your bloodline, become part of the apparatus working against you in a courtroom. Whatever happened between those two brothers in the days and weeks after the robbery, the legal record is clear about which direction each of them ultimately went. For Jeffrey Staten, the consequences of that December morning in 2009 were severe. Following a jury trial, he was convicted on charges of armed robbery and aggravated battery, the latter being a reduced verdict from the original attempted first-degree murder charge. The trial court sentenced him to 50 years at hard labor for the armed robbery conviction, without the possibility of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence, along with an additional 10 years on the battery charge. Combined, the sentence ran to 60 years with both counts served concurrently, effectively making his controlling sentence 50 years in Louisiana State Prison. For a man in his early 30s at the time of sentencing, that number represented the kind of time that swallows a life whole. What that sentence actually means in practical terms is staggering. Based on the timeline of his conviction and the structure of Louisiana sentencing law, Jeffrey Staten is projected to remain incarcerated until approximately 2062. That is not a typo. The year 2062. He would be well into his 80s, assuming he lives that long, before he is even eligible to think about walking out of a correctional facility as a free man. Every year that passes on the outside, every birthday his grandchildren celebrate, every milestone his son reaches as one of the most famous rappers on earth, all of it unfolds while Jeffrey Staten watches from inside. That is the reality he has been living and continues to live now that he has turned 53 years old. What makes his situation even more emotionally complicated is that Jeffrey Staten has never simply accepted that sentence and stopped fighting. For well over a decade, he has continued pursuing legal challenges through the Louisiana appellate court system. And the arguments he has raised are not throwaway filings. One of the most significant appeals he mounted centered on a double jeopardy argument. His legal team contended that being convicted of both armed robbery and aggravated battery arising from the same incident constituted a violation of his constitutional protection against being punished twice for the same crime. It was a real legal argument, not a long shot invented out of desperation, and it made it all the way through the appellate process. The Louisiana First Circuit Court of Appeal took it up, reviewed the record, and still affirmed both the conviction and the sentence. The court concluded that the two charges addressed separate criminal acts within the same event, meaning the constitutional protection he was invoking did not apply the way his team argued it did. That ruling shut one of the more substantive doors he had tried to open. The reason the courts have consistently declined to grant him relief across every argument he has raised comes back to the facts of the case and the nature of what happened inside that store. Prosecutors have repeatedly pointed to the violence documented in the record. The pistol whipping of an employee, the shooting of a victim in the leg after he told them the safe could not be opened, the zip ties, the plastic bag placed over a man's head. These were not details that softened over time or became easier to explain away with legal language. They sat there in the record, concrete and verified. And every appellate court that reviewed the case reached the same conclusion. The conviction was sound. The sentence, as severe as it was legally imposed. Jeffrey Staten's motion to reconsider the sentence was denied at the trial level, and every appeal that followed has produced the same outcome. What gets lost in the legal arguments and court documents is the human cost of all of this. And that cost, more than anything else, is what makes Jeffrey Staten's story genuinely tragic. When he was sent to prison, his son Kentrell was only about 10 years old. Youngboy was a child. He was at the age where kids are supposed to be building memories with their fathers, learning how to navigate the world with a male figure present, absorbing lessons and moments that stay with them for the rest of their lives. None of that was available to Kentrell Gaulden after his father's conviction. Instead of memories built at home or in the neighborhood or at family gatherings, the only framework Jeffrey Staten and his son had for a relationship was shaped by prison visitation rooms. Youngboy grew up primarily under the care of his maternal grandmother, a woman he has consistently credited as the cornerstone of his upbringing. His mother, Shirhonda Gaulden, was also part of his life. But it was his grandmother who served as the day-to-day anchor while his father was absent and while his mother navigated her own challenges. This was not an unusual story for Baton Rouge, not an unusual story for the broader communities that NBA Youngboy has always spoken about in his music, but it was still a formative wound. The absence of a father, especially one removed not by choice but by a criminal conviction, leaves marks that do not simply disappear when a person grows up and becomes successful. In interviews over the years, Youngboy has spoken about the impact of his father's incarceration with the kind of raw honesty that his fans recognize as one of the defining qualities of his music. He has been clear that the memories he carries of his father are largely memories of visitation rooms, not of a home or a neighborhood or a life lived side by side. Growing up, knowing that your father exists on the other side of a locked door, accessible only through scheduled visits and monitored phone calls, shapes a child's understanding of family and stability in ways that do not simply disappear when that child grows up and finds success. Youngboy channeled that reality into his music from the very beginning, and it is part of why his fan base connected with him so deeply. The pain was never performance, it was drawn from real experience, and the absence of his father was one of the most foundational of those experiences. It is also worth thinking about what that absence did to Youngboy's path in the years between his father's conviction and the moment he broke through as an artist. He made clear that after his grandmother passed away when he was around 10 years old, he ended up in a group home and was eventually taken in by the family of a close friend. That trajectory, the loss of his father to prison, the death of the grandmother who had been his anchor, the group home, the borrowed stability of another family's household, is the kind of background that would break a lot of people. Instead, Youngboy turned it into a work ethic and a creative output that the industry is still trying to fully process. But none of that changes what was lost in those years, and none of it changes the fact that his father watched it all from inside a cell. The images of that relationship that have reached the public are largely images of visitation. Youngboy's sister has shared glimpses of family prison visits on social media over the years. And those images carry an emotional weight that is hard to put into words. You are looking at a man who shares blood with one of the most famous people on the planet, and he is sitting in a room where freedom is the one thing nobody can give him. The smiles in those photos, if there are smiles, do not tell the whole story. They are the smiles of people making the best of a situation that should never have been the situation in the first place. Think about what daily life actually looks like for a man who has been incarcerated for this long. Prison routines are not designed to accommodate individual needs or preferences. Your day is structured by the institution, not by your own choices. You wake up when they tell you to wake up. You eat when they say to eat. Recreation time is scheduled and controlled. Visits from family members are regulated by rules and hours that shift depending on the facility's policies. Phone calls are monitored. Every piece of contact with the outside world passes through some layer of institutional oversight. After more than a decade inside that kind of environment, the psychological weight is something that researchers and formerly incarcerated people describe as a kind of slow erosion. You do not necessarily break all at once. You just slowly adjust to a smaller and smaller world. And that adjustment comes at a cost that never fully goes away. For Jeffrey Staden, that world has contracted further with each passing year. He turned 53 years old with a release date that sits more than 3 decades in the future. Every appeal he has filed has come back denied. The legal avenues that once might have felt like genuine possibilities have narrowed over time, not because he stopped trying, but because the courts have repeatedly concluded that there is nothing to remedy. His brother's cooperation, the violence of the original crime, and the strength of the prosecution's case built a legal foundation that has so far proven impossible to dismantle from inside the appellate system. There is also something worth acknowledging about what long-term incarceration does to a person's sense of identity and purpose. When you have been inside for as long as Jeffrey Staden has, the person you were when you walked in and the person you are now are not necessarily the same. People change. People reflect. People carry the weight of the choices they made and the consequences that followed in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes buried so deep that only the people closest to them can detect it. His son has grown from a child into a man and then into a global phenomenon during the span of his father's incarceration. His grandchildren have been born and are growing up. Life has moved at full speed on the outside of those walls, while inside, everything has a different kind of pace. The year 2062 is not a number that feels real when you first hear it, but for Jeffrey Staden, it is the reality that shapes every single day he wakes up inside a correctional facility in Louisiana. And yet the story does not live only in courtrooms and case files. It lives in the family. It lives in the gap between what could have been and what actually is. NBA Youngboy has become, by almost any measurable standard, one of the most successful independent artists in the history of hip-hop. He has placed more projects on the Billboard 200 than any rapper in history. He has built a fan base so loyal and so massive that the industry has had to acknowledge it even when it did not want to. He has navigated his own legal battles, his own stints in custody, his own complicated public life, and he has come out on the other side still creating, still releasing music, still very much present in the culture. His father has watched all of that from behind prison walls. That contrast is not something you can dress up or soften with careful language. A 53-year-old man in a Louisiana prison with a projected release date in 2062 watching his son become a generational talent while he files denied appeal after denied appeal. Every birthday Youngboy's children celebrate is a birthday Jeffrey Staden does not get to be present for as a free grandfather. Every moment of success his son achieves is a moment filtered through the lens of a correctional facility visiting room rather than experienced in the open air as a family. These are the years that cannot be recovered. The time that has already passed does not come back, and the time still ahead of him grows shorter as his age grows higher. And it is not just the big moments that get lost. It is the small ones too, the ordinary days that make up a life. The phone call on a random Tuesday, the drive to get food, the ability to sit in a room with your family without a clock ticking down your visiting time, and a guard standing in your peripheral vision. Those are the things that long-term incarceration strips away quietly and permanently. Jeffrey Staden has not experienced those ordinary moments with his son since Cantrell was 10 years old. That is more than 15 years of ordinary days that never happened between them. No amount of chart success or streaming records or fan loyalty can manufacture what was lost in those years. And there is something deeply sobering about sitting with that reality when you peel back the layers of this story. NBA Youngboy has 12 children of his own now. He has built a family that is enormous by any standard, and his father, who is the patriarch behind all of that bloodline, has had almost no access to any of it from outside a prison facility. He has grandchildren he has never been able to hold outside of a correctional environment. He has watched his son go from a struggling kid on the streets of Baton Rouge to a man with millions of monthly listeners on Spotify, a presidential pardon, and a devoted fan base that has followed him through every legal battle and every release. Jeffrey Staten has seen all of that unfold while the walls around him have stayed exactly the same. His legal team has not given up entirely. In circumstances like these, attorneys sometimes continue searching for procedural issues, new interpretations of sentencing guidelines, or changes in case law that might open the door that has previously been closed. Louisiana sentencing law has evolved in certain ways over the years, and the broader national conversation about mass incarceration and the impact of extremely long sentences on individuals and families has created some political and legal momentum in various states. Whether any of that momentum ever translates into something meaningful for Jeffrey Staten specifically is impossible to predict. But the honest reality is that every year that passes without a successful appeal makes the path to any different outcome harder to travel. The original conviction has been reviewed multiple times. The sentence has been upheld. The courts have made their position clear on multiple occasions, and there is nothing in the public record to suggest that a dramatically different result is waiting just around the corner. What that means for a 53-year-old man serving a 50-year sentence is that the math is becoming increasingly brutal. Even if something changed tomorrow, even if some court found some avenue that previous courts had overlooked or declined to address, Jeffrey Staten has already lost the years when his son was growing up. He has already lost the years when his grandchildren were born. He has already lost a decade plus of ordinary life that no legal remedy can restore. The best possible outcome at this point would still arrive decades too late to undo what the years have already taken. And that is what makes this story not just legally complicated, but genuinely deeply sad in a way that is hard to fully articulate. What remains is the human story. And that story is one that keeps drawing attention precisely because it sits at the intersection of extraordinary fame and devastating personal loss. Jeffrey Staten is not famous. He is not a public figure in a traditional sense. But he is connected through blood and family to a man who is one of the most recognized names in hip-hop. And that connection keeps his story alive in spaces where it might otherwise go unnoticed. The prison visits captured in photos and videos, the TikTok posts from fans who have followed the story over the years, the brief references in interviews, all of it adds up to a portrait of a family trying to maintain connection across a divide that a criminal sentence created, and that the appellate courts have repeatedly refused to close. At 53 years old, Jeffrey Staten's life continues to be defined by the walls around him. The morning of December 1st, 2009 set a chain of events in motion that his own appeals have not been able to undo. His brother's testimony, the violence of the crime, the 50-year sentence handed down without the possibility of parole, the failed appeals that have stretched across more than a decade, the projected release date sitting somewhere in 2062, the childhood his son spent growing up without him in Baton Rouge, the family visits conducted in correctional facilities rather than backyards or living rooms. All of it adds up to a story that does not have a clean resolution or a redemptive ending waiting just around the corner. NBA Youngboy turned his pain into music, and that music connected with millions of people around the world who recognized something real in it. His father turned his pain into appeals, and those appeals have so far led nowhere. Two members of the same family shaped by the same roots in the same city living lives that could not be more different. That is what makes this story hit the way it does. It is not just about a robbery in 2009 or a sentence handed down in a Baton Rouge courtroom. It is about what happens to an entire family when one decision alters the course of everything, and how that alteration ripples forward through time in ways nobody can fully predict or fully recover from. The cycles of poverty and limited opportunity that defined Baton Rouge in the years leading up to that December morning did not invent themselves overnight. They were the product of generations of systemic pressures, of neighborhoods where the path out often felt narrower than the path deeper into the streets, of young men watching older men disappear into the system, and then finding themselves standing in the same place years later. Jeffrey Stadden was living inside that cycle when he made the choices that led him into Albie's market that morning. His son would later grow up inside the same cycle, navigating the same streets, feeling the same absences, and eventually finding a way to transform the weight of it all into a body of work that spoke to countless others carrying similar loads. The difference is that one of them remains locked inside the consequences, while the other has used those same consequences as fuel to build something that reached far beyond the city limits of Baton Rouge. Consider the psychological architecture of a sentence that stretches past the expected lifespan of many of the people who will never meet the man serving it. When a person is told they will remain incarcerated until 2062, the number itself becomes a kind of abstract horizon. It is not tomorrow, it is not next year. It is a date that exists in a future most people only imagine in the context of science fiction or distant history. For the person living under that number, every birthday becomes a quiet reminder of how much of the calendar has already been consumed and how much still remains. At 53, Jeffrey Stadden has already spent more than a decade and a half of his adult life inside. The years between his early 30s and his mid-50s, the years when many people build careers, raise children, establish households, accumulate the ordinary markers of a life lived in freedom, those years have been spent under institutional control. The person who walks out in 2062, if that day ever arrives, will not be the same person who walked in. The body ages differently under those conditions. The mind adapts in ways that are not always visible to outside observers. Relationships with family members who visit become shaped by the rituals of the visiting room rather than by the spontaneous interactions of everyday life. Children grow into adults. Grandchildren arrive and grow without the presence of a free grandfather. The emotional distance compounds even when the love remains. Youngboy has spoken in his music and in interviews about the ways that absence shaped him. The rawness that fans respond to in his catalog is not manufactured. It is the sound of someone who learned early that the people who are supposed to be there sometimes cannot be, and that the systems that take them away do not always offer second chances on a timeline that makes sense for the people left behind. His grandmother's death, the group home, the borrowed households, the early brushes with the juvenile system. All of it layered on top of a father who existed primarily as a voice on a monitored phone line and a face across a table in a room with cameras and time limits. That is the soil in which an artist of his intensity grew. And while the industry has celebrated the output, the numbers, the chart dominance, the independent infrastructure he built, the human cost that produced that output remains largely unexamined by the same audiences that stream the songs. Jeffrey Stadden sits on the other side of that equation. He is the living reminder of the origin story that his son has never fully escaped, even as the son has become a figure of almost mythic scale within the culture. The visitation photos that surface from time to time carry a particular kind of gravity. They show a family maintaining connection under conditions designed to make connection difficult. The plastic chairs, the painted walls, the presence of correctional staff, the knowledge that the visit will end at a predetermined hour and that the next one may not come for weeks or months depending on distance, work schedules, and institutional policies. For a man whose son has achieved the kind of success that allows private jets and multi-million-dollar homes, the inability to simply drive across town and sit in a living room without supervision becomes a quiet form of ongoing loss. The wealth and fame do not unlock the cell door. They do not rewrite the appellate record. They do not change the fact that the controlling sentence remains in place and that the courts have declined every invitation to revisit it. The family continues to show up. The visits continue. The photos continue to circulate among fans who recognize the tragedy embedded in them, but the fundamental structure of the situation remains unchanged. Long-term incarceration also reshapes a person's relationship to time itself. Outside, time moves according to seasons, school years, career milestones, the growth of children. Inside, time is measured in counts, in meal schedules, in the intervals between visits, in the slow accumulation of days that do not differ much from one another. Researchers who study the effects of decades-long sentences describe a phenomenon in which the incarcerated person begins to experience the outside world as a kind of parallel reality that continues without them. Births, deaths, marriages, divorces, career peaks, all of it happens at a distance. The person inside receives the news through letters, phone calls, and brief visits, but cannot participate in the events themselves. For Jeffrey Stodden, that parallel reality includes the entire arc of his son's career, from the early mixtapes that first gained local attention to the national breakthrough, to the legal battles that mirrored, in some ways, the father's own entanglement with the system, to the eventual presidential pardon that freed the son while the father remained confined. The irony is difficult to ignore. One generation receives a measure of clemency, while the previous generation continues to serve a sentence that was designed to be final. The broader conversation about mass incarceration in Louisiana and across the United States has gained traction in recent years. Activists, legal scholars, and some lawmakers have pointed to the human and fiscal costs of sentences that effectively amount to life terms for people who committed their crimes in early adulthood. Louisiana has long ranked among the states with the highest incarceration rates, and the structure of its sentencing laws for violent offenses has produced large numbers of people serving decades without meaningful opportunity for parole. Whether those broader discussions ever produce a specific remedy for a case as thoroughly litigated as Jeffrey Stodden's is an open question. The appellate courts have already reviewed the conviction and the sentence multiple times. The factual record of the robbery has not changed. The violence involved remains documented in the same detail that persuaded juries and judges more than a decade ago. New legal theories can be advanced. Changes in case law can be argued. Political shifts can create openings that did not previously exist. But none of those possibilities erase the years that have already been served or restore the ordinary moments that were lost while the son was growing up without a free father present. The emotional core of this story is not the legal technicalities or the precise number of years remaining on the sentence. It is the recognition that a single morning in December 2009 permanently altered the trajectory of an entire family. The choices made that day carried consequences that extended far beyond the two men who walked into the store. They shaped the childhood of a boy who would later become one of the most prolific and polarizing figures in modern hip-hop. They shaped the relationships between siblings, between a father and the children and grandchildren he would only ever know through the constraints of the visiting room. They shaped the music that millions of people now stream, music that carries the imprint of that absence even when the lyrics do not name it directly. The success that Youngboy has achieved does not cancel the loss. It simply exists alongside it, two parallel realities that share the same bloodline and the same city of origin but almost nothing else in terms of lived experience. At 53, Jeffrey Stodden continues to wake up inside the same institutional structure that has defined his days since the conviction. The routines remain. The limitations remain. The projected release date remains a distant number on a calendar that most of the people who care about him will not live to see arrive. His son continues to release music, to navigate the complexities of fame and family and the residual effects of his own legal history, to raise a large number of children who will grow up knowing their grandfather primarily through stories and occasional visits, rather than through the everyday presence that free grandparents often provide. The family continues to make the trip to the facility when circumstances allow. The photos continue to surface. The story continues to circulate among fans who feel a personal connection to the pain that runs through the music. And the walls continue to stand exactly where they have stood for more than 15 years. This is the full weight of the situation. A man who is the father of one of the biggest names in hip-hop remains confined under a sentence that was designed to outlast him. Every appeal has been denied. The legal record remains intact. The human cost continues to accumulate with each passing year. The ordinary life that was interrupted on that Tuesday morning in 2009 has never resumed and, barring some unforeseen development, will not resume for decades more. The contrast between the two lives that grew from the same roots in Baton Rouge remains as stark as it has ever been. One continues to create and release and connect with millions. The other continues to serve the time that a Louisiana court handed down more than a decade ago. That is the story. That is the reality. And that is what makes the whole thing land with the force that it does. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you think about this story and what it means for families dealing with long-term incarceration. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that button so you never miss a documentary like this.